Yes, can you hear me? Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the first panel today entitled Destruction and Resilience, the Demise of Traditional Land-Owning Elites. My name is Bartosz Dziewanowski-Stefańczyk. I'm a researcher at the Academic Department of the European Network Remembrance and Solidarity and at the German Historical Institute in Warsaw. But the story today is not about me. We have three great speakers today and a commentator. And I would like to introduce them one by one. So the first speaker will be Maciej Radziwiłł, who studied Arabic language, philosophy and sociology at the University of Warsaw. He was active member of the independent publishing movement under communism. He graduated from the Faculty of Management of the Warsaw University and holds MBA diploma from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. In the 90s, Maciej Radziwiłł worked as an equity research analyst in CS First Boston and UBS in London. After 2000, he became an investor, advisor, and non-executive director of a few Polish and international companies in Poland and Central Europe. He is a board member in a few charities in Central Europe. Maciej Radziwiłł is the chairman of the Princess Czartoryski Foundation. He set up the Trzy Trąby Foundation in 2017, which focuses on preserving the legacy of the aristocratic families, collects arts, sponsors cultural, charitable projects and scholarships. Maciej Radziwiłł actively preserves the Radziwiłł family legacy in Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, and Lithuania. And before we start, I would just like to address our online participants that should you like to ask any questions, please write them under the streaming on Facebook or YouTube. Okay, the floor is yours.
Good morning. Thank you for inviting me for this conference. It's a privilege for me. University of Warsaw is my alma mater twice. I worked for 3 years in the Faculty of Sociology, but it was long time ago. Polish aristocracy, does it still exist? I had a unique opportunity to conduct a long participant observation, being probably the only sociologist among the members of the aristocratic families in Poland. This observation lasted more than 50 years. Obviously, when I was a child or a teenager, I did not have any sociological apparatus, but later when I studied sociology and at the University of Warsaw and worked as a tutor, my participant observation became more professional and I could analyze my earlier experience with sociological concepts. Aristocracy emerged in the 19th century from the old nobility elite, which historians in Poland call możnowładztwo, until the 16th century and magnateria between 16th and 18th century. Due to an enormous differentiation between most of the nobles and magnates in the 17th and 18th century, the general word nobility does not mean much in the Polish context, where some nobles were less affluent than some peasants. Nobility accounted for about 10% of the population of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. In the Polish case, nobility and aristocracy are two separate groups. Polish aristocracy is a sociological phenomenon which has yet to be studied in a more systematical way. A study of Rafał Smoczyński and Tomasz Zarycki, Totem inteligencki, arystokracja, szlachta, ziemiaństwo w polskiej przestrzeni społecznej, represents one of a very few more systematical sociological researches of the Polish aristocracy. It is a valuable study, but in my opinion, the authors made two major mistakes in describing the phenomenon of the Polish aristocracy after World War II. First, in my opinion, the authors do not define this group very well. They seem to qualify each family with a certain aristocratic title as member of the group. This is wrong, as they do not acknowledge that there are over 200 families who had an aristocratic title. This does not mean that they are aristocrats. It was simply fashionable to get a title among a modest nobility in the 19th century. Many members of such families presented themselves as counts, even if the title was given to the most senior member of the family or restricted to one branch. It was easy to obtain a title of count from the Pope or some European monarchs. Such titles could have been simply bought. There is a well-known anecdote about a noble who sent a manager of his estate to Rome to get a title of count. The manager was very proud that he completed all the formalities and sent a message. "Sir, I got a title for you. It was cheaper than I expected, so I got one for myself as well." Moreover, there are a few very old families who are descendants of the Ruthenian or Lithuanian Grand Dukes, but they should not be qualified as aristocrats. A good example is the Giedroyć family, who have a prince title, but have not played any significant role since at least 15th century. I remember my conversation with Jerzy Giedroyć, a famous Polish intellectual, who told me once, "We, the Giedroyćs, have lost our wealth before you, the Radziwiłłs, became rich and powerful." Second, the authors of the study do not acknowledge the evolution of the group in the post-World War II times. This is perhaps because the study was conducted simply too late, when the generation of the aristocrats who reached adulthood before the war died out. The authors seem not to notice that the Polish aristocracy in the last few decades underwent a major change. They do not acknowledge that it was a group defined by a generational experience of people born in the end of the 19th century and the first 10 to 15 years of the 20th century. While most of the generation born in the 1920s or 30s inherited similar self-identity, only a few people born in the 50s, 60s, 70s consider themselves aristocrats. In the 19th century, the core of the Polish-Lithuanian aristocracy consisted of about 12 families who played a paramount role in the politics of the former Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth for more than 1 century and survived until then. These are Czartoryski, Branicki, Krasiński, Krasicki, Lubomirski, Potocki, Radziwiłł, Sanguszko, Sapiecha, Tarnowski, Tyszkiewicz, Zamoyski families. Until the collapse of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, there were quite a few new entrants into the group of the leading families. Talented politicians were able to build both political and economic positions within one generation. This is the case of, e.g., of the Zamoyski, Sapiecha or Sobieski, who entered the elite at the end of the Sapiechas and Zamoyski entered the elite at the end of the 16th century, the Sobieskis later. Politics was the way to build fortunes in one generation. In the 19th century, when the former Polish political elite lost its ability to run the country, new entrants could occur on the back of strong economic progress of some families. New way of entering the aristocratic elite came at a time when some of the leading families' wealth suffered badly due to the consequences of the Napoleonic Wars and confiscations after the November uprising of 1830, which badly hit families like the Czartoryskis and the Sapiechas. At the same time, landowners who owned large farms in today's Ukraine benefited from new export opportunities after Russia pushed the Turks out from the Black Sea coast. New harbors like Odessa opened new grain evacuation opportunities supported by the expansion of the railroad networks. It built the wealth of the families like the Belina, Brzozowski, Grocholski, Sobański, Jaroszyński, Pruszyński, Orłowski, Dzieduszycki, etc. The importance of magnate families in Italy is measured by the number of cardinals. Number of members of the Senate is the same measure for the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. While families like the Radziwiłłs, Potockis, Sapiechas had over 40 senators, the newcomers had usually 1 or 2 members of the Senate who sat on the backbenchers. The decline of a few leading families led to a few marriages between the old elite and the new one, thus absorbing the newcomers to the top of the league. A few other important families built their wealth in different regions than what is today Ukraine. Other entrants were the Dębińskis, Przeździeckis, Żółtowski race, etc. Some of those families have a long history and ancient aristocratic titles, but they did not belong to the top elite of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Obviously, all the newcomers belonged to the nobility, but none of those families played any significant role until the late 18th century. In the period between World War II and World War I and World War II, the broadened elite underwent a visible consolidation. Until 1918, when Poland regained independence, leading Polish families often married to German, Austro-Hungarian, Russian, Italian, or French aristocracy. Such marriages almost disappeared after World War I. While patriotism was an important value among aristocrats in the 19th century, the group was very cosmopolitan at the same time. They felt members of the European aristocratic community, but this changed dramatically after 1918. During World War II and early years of communism in Poland, economic strength, social and political position of the aristocracy in Poland were destroyed. Paradoxically, new adverse circumstances helped to consolidate the aristocratic milieu. This phenomenon occurred due to several factors. Firstly, it was a generational phenomenon. The concept of generation is often used in the Polish sociology in a non-demographic meaning. Polish sociologists often apply the concept of generation to a group of people who shared a dramatic experience when they were young. Such generational experience is often transformed into a generational myth which builds self-identity of a group. Thus, we are talking about the Warsaw Uprising, 1956, 1968, 1980 generations, etc. Dramatic events have always had a deep impact on a relatively small groups of people who were not only witnesses, but also took an active part in the drama. It was used, among others, by such respected sociologists as Jan Garewicz or Jerzy Mikułowski-Pomorski. A few years ago, Jeff Schatz used the sociological concept of generation to describe group of the Polish Jewish communists born in the early 20th century in his book, The Generation, The Rise and Fall of the Jewish Communists in Poland. The traumatic experience of the war, during which both the Germans and Soviets targeted the Polish elite, and particularly Polish landowners, was a generational experience that consolidated the group and built its self-identity for the rest of their lives. Although one could argue that the whole Polish society suffered similar hardship and the experience of aristocracy was particularly painful in relative terms. Their entire lifestyle changed. They lost significant wealth. They lost homes which their families held for centuries. A very significant part of this group participated actively in the military, whether the regular army or the underground army. This dramatic change affected mostly people who were in the late 20s or 30s when the World War II started. When the war ended, the generation had to face the biggest challenges. They had to find new place in new adverse circumstances and take responsibility for their own children and their parents who are unable to adjust in the new situation. It should be stressed that a particularly difficult situation was faced by women who often lost their husbands and had to find jobs to support their families. In many aristocratic families, a disproportionate percentage of men lost their lives due to their military activities or repressions from both the Germans and the Soviets. Women usually play a more important role in transferring family traditions and values than the men. Secondly, almost all Polish aristocrats who used to live in their manors and castles scattered around a large territory of Poland before the World War II settled in Warsaw after 1945. Huge family gatherings were not very common in the period until 1939. This may be easily observed in the group photos of the weddings. There are very few pictures where you can see more than 50 people. In my opinion, at least 80% of those who did not emigrate found their place in Warsaw, with 10% in Kraków and the rest settling in Poznań, Wrocław, or Gdańsk. Concentration of aristocratic milieu in Warsaw enhanced their social life despite relatively remote genealogical links. Although large aristocratic family gatherings were difficult due to logistics and poverty, social life flourished. Many people who hardly knew each other before the World War II became close friends. Common destiny and common challenges strongly consolidated the group. The group of families also represented a certain safety network for those who were in a particularly difficult situation. Thirdly, the first 10 to 15 years after communists took over Poland, the aristocrats were considered class enemies and lived under a constant threat of communist revenge. In the Soviet Russia, just after the revolution and civil war, aristocrats were left in peace. But later, in the Stalinist period, they were exterminated. This history is well described by an American historian, Douglas Smith, in his book, The Former People. However, the destiny of the Russian nobility was well known to the Polish aristocracy, and their fear was absolutely justified. Finally, the Polish version of Stalinism lasted 4 years only, and later communist times were relatively mild. Only a few aristocrats were sentenced by Polish communist authorities after World War II, while during the Stalinist period, it was extremely difficult for aristocrats to enter any universities. After 1953, no similar restrictions were observed. Fourthly, there were no new entrants, since there were no criteria to enter the aristocratic milieu anymore. While in the 17th and 18th centuries, successful politicians could enter the elite, and in the 19th century, nobles of modest origins could achieve a status of aristocrats when they became rich, no entry was possible after World War II. Factors which contributed to the strength of the consolidation gradually disappeared when the generation of those who were in their 20s or 30s in 1939 and had their own estates and families before the World War II started passing away. New generations did not have the same common destiny which formed their parents' and grandparents' self-identity. While in the 1980s there was still a strong sense of belonging to one big family, this consciousness started to fade when the generation of former owners passed away. The last person from that generation, who belonged to one of the leading families, passed away in 2021 at the age of 104. She was the last representative of the group who was married, had offspring, and her own estate before World War II. Aristocracy has never been a formal group. Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth never had its own heraldry. Aristocracy was an informal network, as aristocrats had to have a clear will to be a part of the group. He or she had to live close to the core of the group as well. Those who, after World War II, lived far away from the main centers like Warsaw and Kraków in Poland, or Paris and London abroad, had little chance to become members of the group, even if they belonged to one of the leading families. To become an aristocrat, one had to be accepted by the key members of the club. Once these key members, who were guardians of the consistency of the group, passed away, there was no one to consolidate the group. External factors such as existential threats disappeared. More and more marriages with people from outside the aristocratic families or well-known noble families took place. While people entering aristocratic families, husbands or wives, are often ready to look after the tradition and keep the family links, it is very difficult for them to transfer the aristocratic self-identity to their children and grandchildren. This phenomenon is particularly strong among Polish aristocrats who emigrated during the World War II. Only a very few members of those families in the third generation speak any Polish and keep any Polish aristocratic self-identity. Today, new generations of the old aristocratic families who had no significant contact with the generation of former owners do not consider themselves aristocrats. They do not feel the members of any big family consisting of 20, 30 families. They feel some kinship with the people of the same surname, but nothing beyond that. There have been more attempts to stop the decline by forming different organizations, family unions, etc. The decline or disappearance of Polish aristocracy as a group is strengthened by adverse demographic trends in some of the families that formed the elite until 1939. Some of the leading families are no longer represented in Poland, and they have less than 2 or 3 members. None of the aristocratic families came back to the old lifestyle of their ancestors. Unlike Czechia, Hungary, or Slovakia, Poland did not make any systematic reprivatization. A few of the old manors were given back to the former owners, or rather their heirs, but most of them were unable to maintain former family seats. Polish aristocracy is a closed chapter. It does not mean that there is no role for the members of the aristocratic families and that legacy of this group should be forgotten. The strengths and weaknesses of the aristocracy, its ups and downs, should be a lesson for the new political and business elites. Some patterns of elite are universal. Members of the aristocratic families play an important role in some local communities which have been strongly linked with some of those families. Presence of representatives of such families is often very welcome by local communities who want to keep their self-identity. Finally, members of the aristocratic families may play a very positive role in building strong relations with Belarus, Lithuania, and Ukraine. Most of the former magnates were present in those territories for a few centuries. These families are a part of both Polish history and history of our neighbors. Despite a long period of Russian domination and Soviet totalitarianism, Polish-Lithuanian aristocratic families are well remembered in those countries and are considered an important element of their cultural heritage and self-identity. Just to summarize, Polish aristocracy has a long history, but paradoxically, the culmination of this social phenomenon occurred when it was about to disappear. The intensity of its life came when the group lost its social and economic position, which was its main feature in the past centuries. The culmination was built on the generational experience of the last generation of landowners and had to face the challenges of World War II and communism. Younger generations of the aristocratic families are unable to maintain this consistency of the group. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, let me introduce the second speaker. Ling is a PhD candidate at the Max Weber Center for Advanced Cultural and Social Studies of Erfurt University, Germany, specializing in the cultural governance model under the land transformation in Shenzhen, China. Sorry for my pronunciation. Ling's work delves deeply into the intersections of traditional governance and modern urban economies, drawing parallels across historical and cultural lines. With an educational background in design and law, Ling has honed an interdisciplinary approach to the social sciences. She has been involved in impactful research on ownership structures and state capitalism and cultural governance models, contributing significantly to prestigious projects on socioeconomic differentiation in Shenzhen. She is a recipient of numerous scholarships and awards, including a prestigious grant from the German Research Foundation, which is indeed an achievement. Ling Li's research interests span cultural governance, urban planning, and addressing inequality within urban village structures. The floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. May I get? Morning, everyone. Today, I will be discussing the central actor of my thesis, kinship organization and its power dynamics in modern society. As many of you have already familiar with the European background, so I will mainly focus on the case of Shenzhen. In the end, I will draw some comparative insights between Shenzhen case and the Europe case. When studying the kinship organization in Shenzhen, I noticed an interesting parallel with European gentry families. Both of the power historically related to the land. This observation raised a key question for my research. Do these traditional authorities manage or control land and play a significant role in contemporary society? And how have they adapted to modern social economy changes? To explore this, I chose Shenzhen as a case study to understand how kinship organizations function in modern China. First, let me take a quick look of the Shenzhen location. Shenzhen is a metropolitan city in southern China. As you can see, it's next to Hong Kong. It was China's first special economy zone and a palette for socialism with Chinese characteristics. But in the past, Shenzhen was just a fishing village. But after the China reform and opening up in 1978, it became a hub for migrant workers, leading to rapid urbanization. Former rural villages transformed into urban villages. Initially, these urban villages were managed by village committees. During urbanization, these committees evolved into shareholding cooperatives, which are kinship organizations but still defend villagers' ownership claims due to their shared ancestry. Beyond land management, shareholding cooperatives continue to control the urban villages' collective assets and are responsible for promoting both economic and cultural development. Specifically, today, shareholding cooperatives have three more functions. They preserve clan spirit. They act as economic entities seeking profit. They assist the government in managing urban population. What's more, most of the shareholding cooperative leaders often hold political roles, like local people Congress representative. That means they also have access to give political voice to the public. And more importantly, the influence largely comes from managing collective land. To know more about kinship organizations, the shareholding cooperatives, I spent almost 5 years conducting field work in different urban villages in Shenzhen, building relationships with these shareholding companies, members, and local villagers. During this time, I conducted both formal and informal interviews, gathered participant observation data, and analyzed shareholding cooperatives' documents and official records. Through this research, I was able to gain deeper insights into the daily operations of these members and to see how they negotiate their role in the modern urban environment. In my investigation time, I found so many interesting cases. Temple is one important manifestation. As you might know, temples usually appear with ancestral hall in China, which deeply rooted in ancestral stories, making them perfect case studies for discuss about land transformation and power change between local kinship group and government. One of the most significant sites I studied is the Fengyan Temple, located in Fenghuang village. Most of the villagers' surname is Wen. The village's founding ancestor, Wen Yingling, is the grandson of Wen Tianxiang. Wen Tianxiang is the very famous patriotic hero of the early Song dynasty. This historical connection plays a huge role in how the local community and government view the land. Now, what's interesting here is the tension between villagers and the government over land rights. While the government owns the land, villagers still claim that the 600-year-old temple is proof of the ancestral connection to the land. The historical tie gives them a sense of ownership. They report this temple, rebuilt additional ones like the Earth God Temple and World God Temple to cater to different beliefs, and structured their one culture center to root themselves in the land's history. Besides of this, they also have proofs to prove the ancestors and the relatives made great contributions to the mountain instructions in the past. But the catch is China has dual land system, whether the state owns urban land and collectives own rural land. Since Shenzhen's land was urbanized in 2004, all of the land belonged to the state-owned land. That means the government controls the decisions about all the land. The villagers, despite their strong ties to the temple and buildings, aren't allowed to build new constructions on the mountain before getting the permission from the government, and do any business efforts also face restraints. In 2006, the government designated Fenghuang Mountain as a forest park and made it a key development project for ecological conservation. This further restricted the villagers' autonomy over the mountain business choices. To work within these constraints, in 2011, the Fenghuang villagers and shareholding cooperatives established the Fenghuang Mountain Cultural Tourism Invest Company to manage mountains economy affairs, such as selling incense, souvenirs, and other products, which benefit all the villagers who are shareholders in this shareholding cooperative. And they built their own brand and restaurant to sell foods. However, when it comes to the temple, there is a twist. The villagers technically own the temple, but they can't profit from it because the temple defined as a religious site. Therefore, the shareholding cooperatives set a charity foundation to use temple donations for community welfare and local activities, which tie back into their desire to honor their ancestors by giving back to the society. Besides, these shareholding cooperatives established a promotion association to manage temple operations and donations, keeping everything in line with the ancestor merit spirits. So, to sum up, the government owns the land, but the shareholding cooperatives own the constructions, the buildings. The tour company rents out spaces for commercial purposes, while the promotion association manages the temples, and the charity foundation handles the temple's income. This intricate relationship between shareholding cooperatives, subsidiary companies, organizations, the government, and the business operations shows how traditional kinship structures have tried their best to adapt it to modern economy frameworks. This case isn't isolated. Shanghe filial piety and modern garden is a good case to show the cultural resilience of kinship organizations in culture industry aspect. This place was originally a typical ancestral hall used to celebrate local villages' rituals, but now it turned into a public place for everyone to learn the villager ancestors' filial piety merit. Besides of tourists and residents, the government organized their official teams and the school organized students to be there to learn these merits regularly. For appealing tourists, shareholding cooperative also rebuilt and decorates the surrounding buildings to match the filial piety vibe. You can see it from the McDonald's construction. What's more, they organize different type activities to fit for diverse social demand. Other old architectures like Asian study room also get attention from shareholding cooperatives and governments. Shenzhen Xixiang Primary School was originally an ancient study room funded by villagers Ling's ancestor in 1895, and now it combined with some modern teaching building turned into a public school. Besides of organized lectures on various traditional culture, it designs a characteristic curriculum and set special funds to devote to propaganda local ancestors' story and do other local related culture work. Temples, ancestral halls, and ancestral study rooms, usually built close to each other, all of these are important symbols of kinship culture. I have a map of all the ancestral halls in Shenzhen, and you will see that in many other places, similar tensions may exist in China today. Villagers continuously adapt their land rights linked to their ancestral histories, while the state asserts its ownership over the land. Relatively, European gentry has great autonomy. In Europe, especially after the feudal era, land reform transitioned estates from collective or communal ownership to private property. This gave their gentry elites and landowners full control over the estates, allowing them to modernize, sell, or develop their properties independently. An example of this is the English enclosures movement, where communal lands were privatized in the 18th and 19th centuries, giving individuals landowners full rights over their property. This created a system where private ownership became the dominant model, allowing landowners to generate wealth, develop their estates into profitable ventures, or transform them into heritage sites or tourist attractions. Today, European gentry families and elite classes continue to manage their properties under this private ownership model. They retain a significant degree of autonomy over their estates. Many large estates, such as those in the United Kingdom, France, and Germany, have been turned into successful business. These include tourist destinations, historic museums, and luxury hotels, demonstrating how gentry property management has evolved into a profitable industry. Unlike the shielding cooperatives in Shenzhen, who must navigate their state's control over land, European gentry families enjoy far greater economic freedom. They can expand, sell, or develop their estates without significant government intervention. In conclusion, the comparison between China shielding cooperatives and European elites highlights key similarities and differences in the role of traditional power holders in the modern world. Both groups have managed to maintain a significant degree of influence over their communities by preserving their traditional roles. However, European gentry benefit from private ownership, have greater economic independence, and have more autonomy. While Shenzhen's shareholding cooperatives also still have the right to use the land, but it operates within a framework heavily influenced by state control. By studying these cases, we can better understand how traditional forms of governance and property management continue to shape urban development today. That's all of my presentation contents. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much. Now, the third speaker is Attila Kálmán, who is a historian living in Târgu Mureș, Romania. He's an associate lecturer at the Sapientia Hungarian University of Transylvania in Târgu Mureș. He is interested in the history of the Transylvanian aristocracy since the 18th till 20th century. For many years, he was a member of the Scientific Center for the History of the Romanian Elites at Petru Maior University. He has been working closely with NGOs created by aristocratic families. He is the president of the Pro Castellum Degenfeld Association, founded by the Degenfeld Counts, which is the official organization of the Transylvanian nobility. He's also been involved in the work of the Teleki Castle Association, founded by the Counts Teleki. Over the years, he has written, lectured extensively about the members of different aristocratic families and curated exhibitions on the same subject. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, a little bit about Transylvanian aristocracy, although I think for a Polish audience, talking about Transylvania is not a big deal because we have so much in common, like the Prince Bathory, who became King of Poland. But still, after being part of the Kingdom of Hungary for 500 years, Transylvania became an independent principality, and during the 150 years of its existence, this principality would create its own untitled nobility. And many of the families who became nobles in this period would continue to exist after the Habsburg annexation of Transylvania in 1699. Now, in the Habsburg Empire, Transylvania remained a principality, and even after 1765, a grand principality, the Habsburg monarch holding the title of Prince of Transylvania. So with the arrival of the Habsburgs, a new titled nobility was created. Their titles were granted by the Habsburg monarch in his or her role of Prince of Transylvania. So this is why we are talking about Transylvanian aristocracy. The history of Transylvania in 19th and 20th century is well known, so I won't talk about this. After 1867, part of Hungary in the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, and after 1920, after the Treaty of Trianon, of course, part of the Kingdom of Romania. Now, the last 30 years have seen a surge in different memoirs, interviews, family histories. The first being edited in 1996, basically 2 books we are talking about, and these present the DO period. I will explain what I'm talking about in this case, so what is DO, written by 2 witnesses. Sad thing is that not many academic papers, works have been written about this subject, this topic of the Transylvanian aristocracy during communism, during communist times. Now, the economic annihilation of the Transylvanian, mainly Hungarian-speaking aristocracy started already in 1921. The new Romanian land reform succeeded in diminishing the economic influence of the Transylvanian aristocracy in Romania. Many aristocrats were faced with the difficult decision of staying, becoming Romanian citizens, and of course maintaining what was left of their estate, of their properties, or move to Hungary, so opt, and keep their Hungarian citizenship but lose their estates in Romania. In 1945, the first communist government in Romania introduced on the 23rd of March 1945 a land reform that declared that all the land above 50 hectares would be expropriated. Although tough for many landowners, this was a chance of survival. Those returning to Romania decided to rebuild their lives and their remaining estates. Now, the events of 1949 came as a total surprise, although there were already signs, because in 1948 nationalization already started. But in March 1949, during one night, all the landowning families in Romania were taken to designated towns where they would have their forced or compulsory domicile. So this is the DO from 2 Romanian words, domiciliu obligatoriu. This decision was based on a decree of the Ministry of Agriculture. This stated that it was a completion of the land reform of 1945. So land, livestock, machinery, buildings would be expropriated. There were differences in the implementation, but the idea was that it should have been carried out at the same time all over the country, minimizing the threat of resistance. From witnesses we know that it was carried out between 10 p.m. and 4 a.m. in the morning, but more likely around 2 and 4 a.m. The committees sent to execute the decree were formed of party activists, most of them not locals, and mainly factory workers. Although the decree stated that personal belongings were exempt, the local authorities interpreted this randomly. The luggage permitted ranged from 15 kilograms to 25 kilograms. No jewelry, no furniture, no books, sometimes not even family photo albums. It all depended on the permissiveness of the committee. This sometimes led to tragicomic situations where people would take photos, worthless knickknacks, but forget to hide jewelry, money that would help them later, although it was not always possible under the vigilant eye of the activists. But also, people would value personal belongings with sentimental value more than the generations-old objects. The families were taken in the designated towns to the courtyard of the militia, the new police. There were cases when family members would have their forced compulsory domicile in different towns and could meet only with the approval of the authorities, the case of Count and Countess Holler being in towns 80 kilometers apart from each other for 8 years, Count and Countess Candafi 200 kilometers apart from each other. 2 letters, DO, as I explained, were stamped in their IDs. They couldn't leave town without the permission of the authorities. They had to report every week, usually on Thursday, to the militia. These compulsory appearances were humiliating. Not only the representatives of the former aristocracy were forced to be present, but also others that had, so to say, problems with the law. This situation being illustrated by the question of the militiaman at the weekly appearance, are you a countess or a prostitute? These compulsory appearances would sometimes turn into social events. People would exchange news, discuss family matters while standing in line, sometimes befriend each other. Meetings turning into happy events, ending even in marriage. Count Holler, with irony, mentioned at a certain moment that the Soviet militia acted as a dating agency for his parents. The state didn't provide lodgings or work for the newcomers. Some stayed with their relatives, some with friends, and others had to improvise, so they would stay in basements, huts, attics. This is how the new social class of the basement dwellers was created, as so many of them with self-irony call themselves. Around 3,000 families, around 7,000 people were hit by the decision all over Romania. Most of them lived in basements, although for some, like the family of Count Tisza, the new dwelling was a hut on the hill above the town of Târgu Mureș, where 4 people lived with no drinking water that had to be carried from a distance of 2 kilometers. The Telekis lived on a corridor of the famous Teleki library in Târgu Mureș. Gemma, their daughter, would sleep on the top of the wardrobe because there was no room for a bed. Concerning work, white-collar jobs were out of question. They could work as laborers only. Most of them were badly paid. They would work as factory workers, coachmen, flour sellers, lime burners, maids. Some of them would do private tutoring, and this would become one of their strengths. Even the offsprings of the communist elite would learn languages from aristocrats and listen to stories about the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, about former balls and court life in Vienna, before returning to their well-paid jobs at party headquarters. There were certainly exceptions, like the case of the eccentric Countess Teleki Gemma, who until her death in 2001 would remain a flower seller in one of the gates of the center of the town of Târgu Mureș and continued to live in her basement. In this new life of poverty and hunger, the help of the villagers, former employees, butlers, maids, was life-saving, who, endangering themselves, would bring, sometimes smuggle, food in the towns to their former masters. This period was fatal for some. Some went mad from the persecution of the authorities. Many would develop doorbell scare. One of the fields where the aristocrats could excel without restrictions was sports. Countess Banfi Eva in 1958 was national champion in 100 and 200 meters backstroke. She was on the 4th place worldwide, but she was expelled from the team. Because of her descendants. The children would be ostracized from a very early age, being singled out because of their descendants. They would be barred from becoming members of different organizations. The Pioneers organization, for example, of which all children between the ages of 8 and 14 were members of. They could attend school without restrictions until the age of 14. After that, theoretical schools were off limit, or they could maybe attend evening classes. Often they would be warned that they would not be accepted or even present themselves to exams, succeeding and then barred from entering the institutions. Some children were adopted by other families, graduating under other names. Higher academic degrees were out of question. In the second part of the 1940s and in the 1950s, some aristocrats would be victims of political cleansing. Some would be tried in show trials. The most famous cases were those of Count Bethlen Béla, the model of the Transylvanian aristocrat, never leaving his ancestors' land, no matter what political system may come. He was arrested in 1945 because of his political involvement during the Hungarian administration between 1940 and 1944. Then released and arrested in the same year. Then released, being arrested again in 1946. In 1951, he was offered to emigrate to Hungary. He refused. he was sentenced to prison again for 3 more years, being released in 1954. Count Teleki Adam would be sentenced to prison in a show trial together with the Catholic Bishop of Transylvania, Marton Aaron, in 1950. He would be released in 1956, to be arrested again in 1961, and finally released in 1964. In 1956, as a consequence of the Hungarian Revolution, there were groups formed which aimed, some of them, to overthrow the communist regime and or achieve the autonomy of Transylvania. There were aristocrats involved, who in 1957-58 were put on trial. The most famous case was the case of Baron Huszár József, who was executed in 1958. And you see all the other conspirators being sentenced to life imprisonment and to 15 to 25 years in prison. The case of Countess Teleki Erzsébet is more striking, who was sentenced to 15 years in prison in 1957 as a girl of 19, being charged with multiplying brochures on her typewriter asking for the autonomy of Transylvania. She was also released in 1964. After all these vicissitudes, the social class doomed to disappear was to create its own survival strategies. They would perpetuate the specific characteristics of their social class. The basements, huts, and later communist flats would perpetuate the feeling of a castle interior, with remnants of castle furniture, damaged family portraits, photos, paintings of horses, chipped chinaware, some salvaged from the old family castles, or if not, they would feel the need to buy pieces that reflected the old lifestyle. Count Bildi Dénes, who lived in a shed in the back of a courtyard, found somewhere a set of china to serve tea to those who came to visit. The duality of their life was represented in the fact that most of them would work as laborers, factory workers, coachmen, flour sellers, lime burners, but after work they would transform. Dress in their finest suits and visit relatives, have bridge parties, hold afternoon teas, organize meetings for the young. These gatherings meant changing of information, mainly family news, and also the necessity of keeping track of each other. For these occasions, they would dress in their finest clothes. Most of these clothes were sent by relatives from Western Europe. Suits of the latest fashion, they would stand out in the dull, grey, poor atmosphere of the 50s with their red ties, checkered suits, elegant hats. So it would help keep the illusion of times gone by. These were the elegant basement dwellers. Târgu-Mureș, the town of Târgu-Mureș, was considered as a sort of micro-society because at a moment there were 400 DOs living in the town. For these people, regularity was a way of survival. Going to visit was continued even between these harsh conditions. Between 5 and 7 p.m. every day, everybody could come visit without prior announcement. They thought children were better off without the burden of history. Some of them hid from their children their family background. Later, some would introduce them step by step into the history of the family. This would come back and haunt many of the families at the end of the 20th and 21st century, and beginning of the 21st century, when becoming adults, these children would sometimes reject the heritage of their family. A drastic way out of the humiliations was to move away to Romanian-speaking regions, where these historic names weren't known. Religion played a vital part in their upbringing, and they would continue this relationship with the church. They attended mass, religious service, even during communism, even knowing that they were watched by the secret police. They also remained in contact with the representatives of the church and made religion an important part of the upbringing of their children. The church would be a part of their survival also because some of them would work for the church in its offices or sometimes fictitious jobs created by the church. Count Degenfeld would become an accountant for the Lutheran Church. Count Teleki Ernő worked as a secretary for the Roman Catholic Vicarage in Cluj-Napoca. Education was also very important, inflicting to their children the ways of social behavior specific to their class. Certain ways of speaking, dressing, manners, and strong Christian beliefs, sometimes without explaining the family history, as I told you. Culture was also an integral part of the survival, perpetuating the illusion of the old world. They needed illusions to survive. They would attend classical music concerts, sometimes only the rehearsals, because those were free of charge, as in the case of Countess Haller Eva. Baroness Kemény Katalin could be seen attending classical music concerts almost until the end of her life. She died at the age of 107. Count Haller István would have a collection of opera records. The sound of opera arias would be heard from the basement and be carried by the wind through the streets of Târgu-Mureș, where they lived, and he would teach younger generations of DOs the love of opera. Closeness to nature was to perpetuate and remind many of them of the rural surrounding of their former homes. Taking walks in the surrounding areas of the towns would bring back the memory of hunts, castle parks, horse riding. They would also recreate the memory of a castle park in the gardens of their derelict little houses. What changed was the keeping of pets. The decrepit basements, huts didn't make it possible to keep animals. For some exceptions, because Count Beelde Danish, living in a shed in the back of a courtyard, would still keep a dog. Some representatives of the aristocracy decided to work together, or at least try to find a modus vivendi with the regime, without becoming traitors to their class, but trying to make a better living. The case of Baron Kálmán János, who was the founder of an interwar Transylvanian literary movement, the Helicon, who, after being dismissed from his job at the Secular National Theatre, of which he was a founding member of, in 1952 would work as a lime burner. Later would be rehabilitated and would work in the library of the Theatrical Institute in Târgu Mureș, and in 1959 be hired at a newspaper writing the theatre column. And later also writing politically neutral books, where some of the characters would have the characteristics of the new socialist human being. Baron Czartoryski succeeded in not being a DO, and because of his involvement in viticulture, he would write books about winemaking, later even succeeding in publishing literary works. The question of immigration tormented many representatives of the aristocracy. This aristocracy had had few contacts with its European counterparts, was not accustomed to living abroad for long periods. Allegedly, Baron Opor Gábor, who was Hungary's ambassador to the Vatican and Grand Chancellor of the Order of Malta, said that he wouldn't help those who would have liked to emigrate because they need to stay home, and the community needs engineers and shoemakers. Others were of the opinion that children could go, but parents would not. These being said, the possibility of emigration appeared immediately after 1944-45. Some families did not come back after the end of the war. In communist Romania, after 1949, the first possibility of leaving the country came immediately after 1963, when the decree of 49 was annulled. This concerned mainly the older generations. The next wave was in the 1980s, mainly due to the economic situation. The new emigres never lost touch with those remaining at home, helping them through legal organizations like the Red Cross, the Maltese International, the Johanniter International, or in the case of those settled in Germany, the Hilfsverein Nymphenburg, led by the members of the Bavarian royal house. Through these organizations, they would send clothing, food, medicine, and later money. After 1963, when it was possible, some would return, leading humanitarian convoys to certain kindergartens, hospitals, retirement homes. Some would come even every year. The iconic figure of Countess Bissingen Erzsébet is still present in many minds. She would spend her pension granted by the German state for the help of her fellow Transylvanians emigrating in Europe or those remaining at home. Another iconic figure was Count Teleki Béla, who, because of his political activity, could not come back either to Romania or Hungary. He would settle in the United States of America, becoming the leading figure of the Transylvanian-Hungarian community in the States. Count Oldalagi Ferenc would send a memoir to President François Mitterrand to help the Transylvanian Hungarians in 1990. After 1963, people started moving out of the basements. They would buy small flats, sometimes continuing to live crowded with strangers because they couldn't afford themselves a whole flat, and then later benefiting from the state-allocated apartments. These flats would perpetuate the atmosphere of the castles, becoming mini-castles, the old furniture, the portraits, the paintings of horses. Many would return to their former properties and even visit their former homes. Count Teleki Mihai and Count Holeriene would be welcomed as heroes. Count Teleki would be greeted by the employees of the facility using the castle with his former title. When Count Holler went back to his former castle, it was like a bishop's visit, his son said. The police would be present but not intervene. Colleagues, even superiors, would address them as Comrade Baron or Comrade Count. At this point, many people were already disappointed with the new regime and thought about the good old times before 1949. Sometimes it was irony, sometimes the search of prominence, and there was a change, of course, of generations who didn't hold a grudge against the former social classes. For them it was novelty, a curiosity. Some reporters started writing about members of the aristocracy. The writer Beke György wrote a report about Count Bethlen Gábor with the title The Last Bethlen in 1979, which would become the title of his book of interviews, on the cover with the stylized coat of arms of the family. Count Bethlen was presented as a model, a count becoming a communist model, but who carried with him the characteristics of his class: seriousness, diligence, sense of duty, even in the new circumstances. Count Bethlen worked 700 kilometers away from his family in the southeastern part of Romania, and then coming close only to 100 kilometers away from the family home, becoming the agronomist of a collective farm being respected by the villagers. In 1987, the Kálnoky family returned to their former estate, triggering a reaction in the younger members of the family that would mean a lifelong relationship with Transylvania, continuing even today. The family visits continued in the next year as well, culminating in December 1989, when immediately after the Romanian Revolution, Count Kálnoky-Farkas organized one of the first aid actions with the help of the scouts from Versailles. A very important component of the survival strategy was humor, self-irony. Even today, the descendants of the families and ordinary people talk about different iconic figures who, with their attitude, humor, great stories, made life bearable. Count Mihály Teleki and Countess Teleki Gemma's name come to many people's minds. Both were members of an aristocratic family deeply rooted in Transylvanian history. Although Mihály would emigrate to Germany, Gemma would remain telling people that she was better off selling flowers in her native city in Romania than being a beggar in the shadow of the castle of Schönbrunn. It may sound odd, but the members of the aristocracy would enjoy going to cinemas. First of all, it was affordable, showing old films, historic films with people dressed impeccably. Mainly films where sometimes characters representing nobility were shown as positive characters. The films based on the novels of the famous Hungarian author Jókai Mór, where nobility appears as the forerunner of development. They help other unfortunate social categories. This was a sort of spiritual compensation. After 1963 and the withdrawal of the decree of 1949, there was a change, mainly in the younger generation. The younger generation, influenced by the culture of the 60s, made them turn away from the parents' generation and against what they represented. The new apartments didn't have the old furniture. They wanted to integrate in the new society. But there were some who continued their parents' activities, like the children of Baron Kemény János, Árpád becoming stage designer at the Târgu Mureș Theatre, Zsuzsa becoming a poet and holding literary circles in the communist flats that they purchased after 1963. 1963 meant for many the recognition of the impossibility of change, reconciliation with their fate, which had the consequence of emigration or integration. This period between 1949 and 1989 meant for the Transylvanian Hungarian-speaking aristocracy the almost complete destruction. Many of its representatives survived this period, carrying with them in them their ancestors' legacy, moral values, or class identity. This attitude can be summed up with the simple words of Countess Teleki Gemma, who was asked at a certain point about the aristocratic survival strategy, and she said, "My dear, or you have it, or you don't." Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Now I will ask Sofia Tchouikina to give us a few words of comment. She is an associate professor in Russian history and sociology of Russian society at the University of Paris 8, Vincennes-Saint-Denis, and researcher at the Center for Sociological and Political Research in Paris. She is the author of a book, Former People, Russian Nobility in Soviet Society, devoted to the reconversion strategies of the noble families in the Soviet society between the October Revolution and the Second World War, and the collective memory of their post-revolutionary adaptation. She has also published scholarly articles about the participation of women in a dissident movement in the 1960s, 80s, and the introduction of foreign patterns of arts management in Russian cultural institutions in the 2000s. Her current research is devoted to historical exhibitions and to museum display of the 20th century Russian history. The mic is all yours.
Thank you very much. You hear me? First of all, I would like to say that our panel shows a certain development in our field. I think when this field, the sociology of old elites, started in the 1980s, the first conferences included only cases from several countries, Western European countries, especially France, England, Sweden. Then more and more in the 90s, they started to include other countries, Eastern Europe, Latin America, and now we have really very interesting development. This is a Chinese case, and this is really the case that we do not know very well, and it is great because it opens for us a real possibilities of comparison. And so now we really are able to compare how these old nobilities adapted under communism regimes, and so what consequences it had for social structure. If I had to find the main idea, the main claim or argument which is common for all participants, it is not so easy because the papers are very different, but I think that general question is whether nobilities under communism were changing with changing societies and were adapting and losing some of their habits, qualities, and so on, or it was the other way around, that they, in spite of all, managed to impose maybe some models of behavior, ideas about distinction, and that finally they managed to spread their ways of doing to larger milieus in which they integrated. So these are two different visions of exactly the same process. So now I would like to comment on each paper. So Maciej Radziwiłł asks, in fact, but the paper was so extremely rich, and so I will just comment on something. So he asks a question that is very often asked, how to define nobility, or how to define aristocracy. And I would like to say that yesterday it was already mentioned, there is a book in French of Manique de Saint-Martin, L'espace de la noblesse. And in the introduction, she mentions a paradox, that when she started to study the descendants of French nobility in the 1980s, everyone told to her, it was the beginning of their conversation, the nobility doesn't exist anymore. It doesn't exist anymore. The descendants, it's not like parents. There was a rupture. And then after that followed 3 hours conversation where they gave so many details about how all these remnants of what was noble in fact shaped their lives. So that it gave a possibility to Manique de Saint-Martin to write 300 pages book. And after having written this book, in the end, she comes to the conclusion that, at least in France, there is a social space of nobility. Nobility is not a group, of course, it cannot be defined as a group. It is a social space. It means networks, some loose networks, practices, some elements of lifestyle. There is something that exists, let's say. And I have heard her many times telling in different conferences, because people ask all the time this question, how to define nobility, let's say today, how to define nobility in the end of 20th century, beginning of 21st century. What is this? Who they are, these descendants of nobility? With what definition can we sociologists go to the field? And so she says that it is not necessary to define a nobility before the research. It is such a case. It is the particularity of this case. We go to the field without a definition. So we observe, we take notes, we take interviews, and then we describe what we have seen. Because we know that there is something, but we don't know what it is. But then why, if it is so why this question comes back all the time? This question comes back all the time because I think that there is a problem of a difference between a sociological and historical approach. Because for a very long time, nobility, it was a historical object. It was an object that historians worked on. And of course, historians, they gave a definition of nobility. And it was possible for them, especially if they worked about like 18th, 19th century or previous centuries, it was possible to give a socio-economic definition. And sociological methodology is quite different. Of course, now it is very fashionable to talk about interdisciplinary research and so on, but our sociological methodology, at least in this case, is completely different. That is why we work like that, observing. And then I think that this book that you are criticizing, that yesterday was presented, written by Tomasz Zaryski and Rafał Smaczynski. So I think that their book is also realized in this methodology of like Pierre Bourdieu, and they also show that nobility for them, like they observed in the field that nobility is a set of bodily practices, as he said yesterday, of models of education, and that nobility is finally like influenced larger social groups who start to not imitate, but they took for granted some distinctions, some educational models that were before noble, and now they are more generalized. Yeah. And then I would like to ask some questions. You said that you were a sociologist, and for 50 years you observed. This is, of course, we hope to read your book, your observations about that. This is really great, and I would like to know what was the reaction of people whom you know, people whom you who were your relatives or friends, but whom you observed. Did they like to be observed? What was their attitude to sociology? So were they opened? And second question, I would like to know, maybe it is still a bit provocative, but it is really an interesting question. People who have today, but they are very loud names, very well-known names like Sapega and other Zamoyski and other names. So is it now, today, a valuable symbolic capital that they really can use? Do they feel that they really have a important symbolic capital that they can use? Or is it kind of a dissonant heritage, as we say sometimes, or a difficult thing to carry? Yeah. Thank you very much. Then now I will pass to Chinese case. Ling shows us that landlords imposed, I didn't understand whether all residents, all villages are landlords, or there were landlords who controlled this territory. But they imposed to preserve in the modernized society an old-fashioned mode of control of the territory. That's what I understood. I don't know, when I have read your paper, I thought how to comment on it because I didn't know a lot about China. Then I just have read a chapter from the book of Tamila Lankina, a recent book, where she compares the trajectories of descendants of old elites in Russia, Hungary, and China. Also an original comparison. And she says the following thing. She says that already since the end of the 19th century, the Chinese descendants of old elites were not so actively integrating themselves in the modern professions as did descendants of nobility like in Russia or Poland and other countries. Of course, they integrated in the modern professions. They tried to get diplomas or tried to also to be modern, but not that much, because in fact their priority was gaining of spiritual dominance. Like they professed in temples, or they consecrated themselves to philanthropic activities. They organized kind of ceremonies, and so. And finally, this symbolic and cultural power that they maintained and reinforced, we see in your paper how it is used in real life, if I understood it right. Because what you showed in your paper, that in fact they are using the old spaces, like spiritual places, cultural places, they are a little bit transforming them. They're persuading all residents that of their importance. They're trying to be inclusive in order to maintain the mode of control that they are used to have. And somehow, as far as I understand, this spiritual cultural dominance is more important than the right of property, somehow. But the question that I would like to ask, what is about the Communist Party? So, how do they? What are the relations? So, for instance, the descendants of old elite, can they become mayors of the cities? Mayors of the cities or not, so how it is organized, this relations. So now Transylvanian case very rapidly, but it's a pity because I very much was excited about your article, because I find so many similarities between the Russian case, because like I was myself have written a book about the trajectories of Russian noble families after 1917 who stayed in the Soviet Union, and there are similarities and there are differences. Like similarities like the forced displacement, that they were forced to leave regions and come to the cities, then limited access to education, and also that in the private life they were recreating their familiar lifestyle. So nearly all what you described was so familiar to me, and I was very fascinated by the photos that you showed. I would like to know where they come from. But there are some differences, and this is interesting because in your case, the Hungarian aristocracy, the discriminated aristocracy, is at the same time an ethnic minority and a linguistic minority. And this is there are not many cases like that I know. And so I would like to know, the Hungarians in Romania, they are not only nobles, like there were maybe a million people. So were they all discriminated or not? Or are all Hungarians, not all Hungarians in Romania are not noble, I think. And so who were persecutors? Like when all these people were displaced and they were called to institutions and so on. So who were persecutors? Were they Romanians or Hungarians? Both. Yes. And also, a second important thing that I would like to know, as far as I understood, they nearly all worked at the beginning for the first 15 years in manual professions, This surprised me very greatly because in Russia there was announced that all the nobles will go to the dustbin of history, or that they all will work as manual workers and so on, but it was not true. Because in reality, after Stalin's industrialization, they really needed badly people everywhere, people who were a little bit educated or very educated. And so in Russia, they all managed to integrate to more or less white-collar jobs. And here I have the impression that not. So is it also because of these ethnic differences, linguistic differences, or was it only for 15 years, or did it last the whole time? Yeah. And I think that this Romanian, the case of Hungarians in Romania, they also show us that we need, when we study nobilities, we of course always need to study at the same time this social professional structure of society, because it often explains the differences in their trajectories. This is an obvious thing, but here I thought about it a lot. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to reading your articles and books about it.
Thank you very much. Now I would like to ask the speakers maybe to answer shortly so that we have time for further questions.
Yes, thank you for these questions and comments. I think just my comment about the speech of Attila Kálmán, that we see for people from Poland, for me particularly, it was very interesting to see the comparison of the destiny of the Transylvanian aristocracy versus the Polish aristocracy. Poland seems like a holiday resort vis-à-vis for the aristocrats vis-à-vis Transylvania, even in the Stalinist period. You asked about my participant observation. It was just natural because I come from all the top league families. It's just a coincidence, and my grandmother was one of the main figures in this milieu. She died in 1999, and so it was just natural. And because I studied sociology and then I worked as a tutor, it was very natural for me to use some of the sociological concept, and that's why I also applied this concept of generation, which is extremely important in Polish sociology. One of the most famous Polish sociologists that died a year ago, Paweł Śpiewak, said that Polish society is not divided by classes but by generations and territories, and this concept of generation, this generational experience, is extremely important for us because of our history. And the second question, well, I could talk about it for many hours. What is the perception of these acoustic names? Generally speaking, I've never met in person anybody who had any negative attitude to me because of my surname. Also during the communist time, there are some nuances because of the history and because of the involvement of some of my family members in the war with Sweden, where some people consider some of my family members as traitors. And obviously, it's a small simplification of the Polish history, but it is. But what is very interesting is that I've been traveling to Belarus and Ukraine and Lithuania for the last 35 years, or even at the end of the Soviet times. And because Polish aristocracy is somewhat different from the Russian aristocracy, it is very local. So the people in these three countries, where most of these top families were very present for centuries and were very local, the attitude to these families is very special and extremely positive. And I can't remember the names of two Russian sociologists that wrote a kind of an essay on Belarus, which used to be called the Vendée of the Perestroika. And what struck them, and the most Sovietized part of the former Soviet Union, what struck them was the attitude to the former magnates, and the second thing that struck them was how many people consider nobles, because the Russian aristocracy was a court aristocracy, and in Poland was vice versa. Some of the kings were considered nobody vis-à-vis the top magnates. And at the same time, in Russia, you didn't have this micro nobility that represented about 10% of the Polish society. So this is very interesting that in these territories, which underwent an extremely tough Sovietization, the remembrance of the family and the attitude is amazing and very strong and very, very positive, more positive than in Poland. My family roots are in Lithuania or Grand Duchy of Lithuania, so obviously this is stronger in Belarus and Lithuania rather than in Ukraine, but in those areas where the family was present for centuries, in Ukraine it is also very, very strong and very positive. Thank you.
Thank you, Sofia. Before I answer the question, I want to respond to your comment, because you mentioned and asked if the villagers, they are landlord in China. Absolutely, they are not, because all of the land belong to, after the totally urbanization of Shenzhen today, all of the land are urban land. So all of the land are state-owned land. If you want to say who is a landlord, of course it's the state, not the villagers. And about the Communist Party, how they organize their relations, because as I mentioned, due to the dual land system, the owned land belong to the state, and the collective land belong to the collective committee. It's like the collective committee, they behalf of the villagers to collective the land, but they is just like play as a manager role or agent. They don't have the total right to use all of the land, even though this land belong to the rural areas. They still need to follow the government's policy and regulations. And in the Shenzhen case, all of the land belong to the government. So if the shareholding cooperatives, they don't have the right to own all of the land, but they also heritage the right to use of the land and get some benefit from it. Because in China, in rural areas, and we have the history, the central government didn't cover all of the land, and they will give the grassroots organizations to all the communities. And let's talk about the sharing cooperatives. nowadays they are also economic organizations. That means they could do some business by themselves, but due to the right original from the land, and the land belonged to the state. So all of the business are also under the control of the government. If the government don't allow them to develop land, maybe develop real estate, they are not allowed to do. But they have the right to manage their own constructions, buildings, like the ancestral hall and temples, something about that. And they also change the management ways. For example, in the past, all of the ancestral halls are like family property and they are closed. But nowadays, they open all of the constructions to the public. So the public also could go into this place and learn some history from the local families. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, I will think about it.
Yes, I think I have three questions, so I will try to answer those briefly. Who were the persecutors? I think that was your first question. Well, both Hungarians and Romanians. Now, the decree of 1949 hit all landowning families, so not only aristocrats, lesser nobility, but also untitled landowners. So everybody was hit by this decree from March 1949. So yes, the persecutors were both Hungarian and Romanian. And I have to tell you that in that region, mainly the town of Târgu Mureș, where many of these people lived after 1949, the persecutors were mainly Hungarians, because this is a region with a Hungarian majority. Yes, you asked me about the manual professions. I could find only 3 cases where, in this period, 49 and 63, where members of some families had white-collar jobs. The case of Baron Kemény was one of them, who after being a lime burner went to be a librarian and later a journalist. So starting with 57 or 58. Then there was the case of Baron Csávosi, who was, starting with the 50s, a writer and viticulture. And there is a third case with the Counts Bethlen, who worked as an accountant for a hospital. But he could work as an accountant because he moved away from these places from the region of Transylvania. So he went to the southern parts of Romania, where his name wasn't known. He first moved to Bucharest, to the capital, and then to a smaller town. So he could work, even in the 50s, as an accountant for a hospital. These are only the 3 cases. Everybody else as a labourer. And, oh God, what was the third question?
What is the main explanation of this?
That was the third question? The third was something about if it changed after 63 or something. Yes, it changed. So it wasn't in 1949 to 63, and after 63 it changed because this decree was annulled. Now, of course, those who were manual labourers in the 50s continued to be manual labourers, but their offsprings could go to universities and have white-collar jobs. So after 1963, this totally changed, yes. This is why I concentrated on this period of between 49 and 63.
So it's only 15 years of this?
Yes, those are the really dark times.
This is a lot,
yes,
but
yeah. That's true.
Okay, now I would like to invite probably just 2-3 questions. We have like 6 minutes. So you were the first.
Thank you. Some years of research and comparative research on nobility has taught us that nobility is a very good object for research on social transformation. And so when you see the German nobility, you see several layers of self-description. You have a national nobility, but mostly nobility defines itself as a regional one. So you have many layers. Not only you have a Saxon nobility, you have a Mecklenburgian nobility, and altogether somehow a German nobility. And my question is, if you, Mr. Radziwiłł, mentioned that the Polish aristocracy should die out, my question is, yes, we face social transformation, and the low number of aristocratic families could be a very good precondition to be transformed and to be integrated in other aristocratic social formations. You mentioned the cosmopolitic character of the aristocratic families, and my question is, it could be that a Polish high aristocracy is dying out, but it's integrated in new aristocratic formations on not on a regional level, but on a more European level. Can you make a comment on that?
So maybe one more from Mr. Rydel.
Maciej Radziwiłł, Polish Gentry Association. I have a question to Mr. Radziwiłł. How many palaces were regained by Radziwiłł families and other aristocratic families? And is there any center for foundation Trzy Trąby where in any of these palaces, like for example, Czartoryskis in Kálmán? Czartoryskis in Kálmán regained that they live there and it's their home now. Are there any other cases, such cases? As concerns the attitude toward the name, of course you have answered this question. I must add to that the positive attitude is not only to the very well-known names, but I come from very small gentry and small manor house and so on. So, and again, it's the same, that the people in the villages are very, how to say, very positively to those who were descendants of the owner. Thank you.
Okay, so one more and that's all.
Łukasz Łapiński, Polish Nobility Association. I also got a question for Mr. Radziwiłł about border between aristocracy and nobility. I think you can agree or not. It's just the unofficial and fluent difference based on wealthy and political position, right? You said that there is no measure of that class. You showed a very interesting measure senators in long scale, but it's still only some proposition and unofficial role. Based on titles, you said also that some titles were just bought and some other wealthy families had no titles at all. So that's also not measure. And I think that, do we know, based on an economical position, how many peasant families should have to qualify as an aristocracy, how many cities or villages? Is there such a border? Is there such a measure of difference between, let's say, regular nobility and aristocracy? When noble family became aristocracy. As we know in Polish history, Polish aristocracy is mostly quite new class from late medieval time, from Jagiellonian dynasty, like Radziwiłł, yeah? Radziwiłł family based on a very strong connection with Lithuanian princes, and their economical and political position was built in the 15th century, and family still had such a position till the end of the Polish kingdom. I don't know if you can agree with me that...
Excuse me, so maybe let's
the last sentence. Aristocracy is just part of nobility who had much better economical and political position based on hard work, luck, and took a risk and good moment of family history to extend that family base. Thank you.
Many questions. The last one, the definition of aristocracy is obviously impossible to answer. But as the nobility was a network, because as I said, in Poland, there was no heraldry. So if a peasant became for somehow rich and bought a ring and a proper dress, in 1 or 2 generations became already noble. Nobody questioned that. People were changing coat of arms. There was a mess in comparison with what happened after the partition, where all the 3 empires that conquered Poland introduced very strict bureaucracy in this matter. But aristocracy is a network inside this big network, and simply if the core of this milieu considered somebody a member of the family, he was a member of aristocracy. If not, I remember when I told my grandmother that Mr. Sapientia came, she thought, what did you say? He's an uncle. I said, I've never seen him before, but he's a Sapientia. All the Sapientias are your uncles. But if somebody who was a noble came and I said, Uncle X came, she said, he's not an uncle, he's Mr. So, I mean, it is not that aristocracy is anything better than nobility or broader, but it's a sociological phenomenon that existed, and now it doesn't exist, in my opinion, as a group. Obviously, some people may consider themselves aristocrats, but, for example, my children don't call any Sapientia an uncle, because they don't have this feeling of the unity of these 20 families, let's say. You can argue 20, 30 families, or definitely the core, I would say 10 or 12. So to answer very briefly. Then the question about palaces. We didn't, as a family, recover any or keep. We recovered maybe 1 or 2 small manors, but because we had too many owners, we sold it. But as we say in our families, when you recover a palace, you are happy twice, when you get it back and when you get rid of it. Because if you don't have the land to support a big palace, it's a burden. So my best solution is to cooperate with some museums in many palaces or towns linked with my family, but not owning them. And that was the case in Ukraine, Belarus, until the last difficult times. Lithuania, and the center of my activities in Nieborów, where I have a collection of 400 different paintings and other items. I behave there like an owner, but it belongs to the state, and I don't need to care about repairing the roof. Then the first question about the cosmopolitan aspect of, or European aspect of aristocracy. As I said in my speech, in the late 18th century and 19th century, there were plenty of marriages between the Polish top aristocracy with German, Austrian, Hungarian, and also even Russian aristocratic families. But that didn't mean that they stopped to become very local. As somebody told me, a famous Lithuanian poet, I was at a meeting with him, Tomas Venclova, said that cosmopolitan guy is a educated nationalists. So they were educated locals because they still kept very strongly their local identity. But for some reasons, after Poland regained independence, these marriages with other families stopped. And I have many links with German, French, and Italian families that we are somehow connected. But these links are very, I mean, they last, they have to trace the early 19th century. Sometimes that's where we are connected. So there were some attempts to build some kind of European network of nobility or aristocratic families. But in my opinion, this doesn't work. This for the same reason as it doesn't work in Poland to build a larger, more active association of nobility or aristocracy in particular, or even family unions. These are what Mr. Zarycki and Smoczyński call reconstruction groups. We have plenty of them showing how the Battle of Grunwald was, and there are thousands of people come every year to commemorate a battle of 1410 against the Teutonic Knights. So this is the same kind of, it's not natural. I think, and there were these questions whether the aristocracy exists or not, and that even in France they answer it doesn't exist. But in Polish case, it was just this generation that culminated all these traditions, values, the intensity of this group was amazing, of the life of this group was amazing, and then it disappeared because we, my generation, my children's generation, has completely different experience. I love the history of my family, even that it is not bright sometimes, but this tradition is finished. But it is not finished, in my opinion, in some of the West European countries. I know many aristocrats from Germany, France, Italy. They have the same lifestyle as my grandparents had 80 years ago. So they may complain that their children do not care because the lifestyle is just changed. Everybody wants to live in Paris rather than somewhere in Normandy. But in my opinion, in these countries, this group still exists. But in Poland, this is simply finished. Maybe it's pity, maybe it's good because we became normal citizens. I remember an anecdote. One of my uncles, as a young guy, tried to study medicine. 5 times he was rejected, but then the wife of the top say Polish KGB learned that he was working for 5 years as a nurse. And she said, well, if the Radziwiłł works for 5 years as a nurse, he can go to study medicine because he's no longer class enemy. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all the speakers. Now, unfortunately, we need to move to the break, but should you have any further questions, probably the speakers will be available during the coffee break. Thank you so much.
Thank you.